and welcome. Hi, everyone. So happy to be together with you today for this event. We're together for a presentation titled Creating for Resilience, Indigenous Students in Education. And this event is sponsored by the California Alliance for Arts Education. So happy to have you all here. We have a lot to talk about, so we're going to get started right away. I will introduce myself first. My name is Adelaide Kuhn, and I am Program Director at the California Alliance for Arts Education. A few quick housekeeping notes. This presentation will be recorded. We won't record, or we will remove the recording of the breakout groups. But the main presentation section will be recorded and disseminated on our website and sent out to everyone who registered. So please note that. The other important thing to know is that we will be sending out all of the resources that are mentioned on this presentation out to you, as well as the deck and a number of other links. So please know that following the presentation, you'll be receiving a hearty packet with lots of resources in it. So don't worry about that if you miss something on the slides or what have you. Wonderful. All right. Well, Maggie is going to introduce herself, but I just want to start by saying that it has been such a joy for me to meet Maggie Peters through the planning process for this event. Such a joy to work with you, Maggie. I have learned so much in preparing this with you. You are such a fantastic collaborator, and I'm so happy to be bringing an event co-created with you to the audience of the California Alliance for Arts Education. So thank you so much, Maggie, and I'll pass things over to you.
Thank you, Adelaide. Welcome, if you don't mind going, oh, thank you. Welcome, Hey Young, Ayutki, Hatwatlo, Ayukwi. Just introducing myself, or welcoming you all in the 4 different languages from our area. I inhabit on a daily basis lands from the Sanungwe people and the Hupa Natinaway people. If you are interested in providing a land acknowledgement with me today, you are welcome to discover the lands that you are inhabit using the QR code on your screen and add it to the chat, kind of just to acknowledge the land that you are currently occupying. And as a reminder, these are unceded territories in California. I also wanted to acknowledge that today is a National Day of Awareness for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And there are resources in the link there for you to have access to once we give you the slide deck. Great, I see people adding. Lots of friends from the coast, welcome. I have to open up my chat here. Great. And just as a reminder, this is a website. The Native Land app is a website that is, I think they say like publicly or community created. So if you are aware that there are tribes in the land that you are occupying that are not on this app, that you can contact them and let them know. And it is populated by participants. Great. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So just as a proper introduction, my name is Maggie Peters. I am Yurok and Karuk, and I am joined today by 2 of my favorite women that I've ever met and mentors in not only education and arts and education, but also as cultural mentors. We share a lot of kitchen space and ceremonial space throughout the summers. And so I would like for them to be able to introduce themselves. Kishan, do you want to start?
Hey young, Kishan, ton achuliet, honset mis nachuliet, natenoch mis nachwe, natenoch hochet natenwe, are se chwin kichunyat yan maachunu. My name is Dr. Kishan Lara Cooper, Yurak, Hupa, and Karuk. I'm also a professor and chair of child development and a mother of 2 children. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
And Lynn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Ayuki Koda, Nanatui Lin Risling, Na Karu, Karu Europe, Karu Hupa, Hupa tribe. And I'm very happy to be here and share it with all these wonderful educators and people that are here today.
So at this time, we would like to do a participant poll to find out who is joining us in this learning space. And I have, there it is, ask and you shall receive. Thank you so much, Chantal, for helping us run this poll. So please take a few moments to engage in letting us know who you are. Just maybe 20 more seconds if you don't mind. All right. I hope everybody had a chance. I don't actually see what's happening, the exciting details of the poll, but maybe, oh, there it is. It looks like the majority of us in this space are teachers or teaching artists. Welcome, nonprofit staff members. Thank you so much for joining us today. This helps us a lot. Thank you. All right. So we would like to welcome you into a space where we can do some shared learning. I know that we will probably do most of the talking, but you're welcome to engage in the chat as frequently as you would like. Our hopes and insights for today is to begin by doing some grounding and thinking about our personal identities, segue into some historical and ongoing educational experiences for Native youth, reflect on our current practices, really have a little bit of a more deeper understanding of intent versus impact, and a larger discussion about resiliency through the arts. Please take a moment to add in the chat what you would hope to gain from this session based on the advertisements. If you came here with a particular goal, you can maybe share that now with us. And while you're doing that, just wanted to remind you of some group support. Sometimes people call them meeting norms. It's kind of odd to use meeting norms because this might be the only meeting that we have scheduled right now. So group support, just being mindful of respectful communication, creating a safe space, open to diverse perspectives, and accepting discomfort, right? Every single day we ask our students to come into our classrooms and learn something new. And so we know that they are put in this growth zone every single day. So we are asking you to join in that space that we ask our students to be in every single day. And hopefully that discomfort is your indicator that you are growing. So thank you. All right. One of the things that I like to do with my students as we begin our learning together is to really kind of take a deep breath and check in with how we're feeling. We would like to believe that we are thinking beings that occasionally feel. However, we are feeling beings that occasionally think. And much of our ability to learn is guided by our emotions. So I would like for you to look at the mood meter here. This is a tool that has been utilized by the Ruler Social Emotional Learning curriculum developed by Mark Brackett. And as you can see, it's kind of a coordinate plane where the y-axis is a measurement of energy and the x-axis is a measurement of pleasantness. And in order to be in a space of learning, we would like to be, in the range of greenish yellow, not too deeply green or yellow, so closer to the center. But take a moment to either add into the chat how you are feeling today, or you can discover a new feature, possibly to you on Zoom, called the annotation feature. You can find the annotation feature by going to the top of your Zoom screen. There'll be a green message bar that says you're viewing Adelaide's screen, and then a view options right below, or right next to it, sorry. Drop down that menu and you can see the word annotate, choose a stamp. I like the star stamp, I don't know why. But you can go ahead and populate a word with a stamp just so that we can see visually how you are feeling in the room. In my classroom, sometimes if I see a lot of students that are in the blues or the reds, then that helps me to adjust my teaching and the expectations. Even if it's anonymously done, I know that I need to take some more time for thinking and reflecting, deep breaths, give more space to students to maybe move their bodies and get up and stretch around and be responsive to where they're at. So lots of yellows and greens today. Thank you so much for engaging with that. How exciting, thank you. And if you are feeling a little bit blue, then please do everything you can to take care of yourself in today's lesson. Get water, take your stretch breaks, get a snack. I am aware that this is being recorded. It is always something that you can watch at a later date when you're feeling a little better. All right, thank you so much. The annotations are super fun. All right, do you want to go to the next slide?
I do. Once I figure out, I'm going to clear Maggie and get out of the annotate and then advance the slides. There we go.
Great. So let's begin by joining in a brief reflection of who you are as we enter the shared space. So let's reflect just for a moment. And if you like to reflect by writing things down, or maybe in an artsful reflection, you can grab a piece of paper and some colored pencils and describe how this reflection points in either words, maybe they are in images. But let's think for a moment about who you are, such as in your expectations about your generation based on gender, sexuality, family norms. Perhaps who you are is deeply guided by your religious or cultural behavior norms. For those in education, which were several of us, think about how we might conduct ourselves in our classrooms with the lesson selection perhaps, or how we are making choices throughout the day. Are they teacher focused? Like, are those practices about pleasing me or ourselves? Or are they about pleasing our students and really being attentive to their learner variability? Take a moment to think about, have you made an effort to learn about the local history in the area that you live, the cultures of your student population? And maybe even, are you working towards learning about how trauma impacts learning? And lastly, have you thought about how maybe your childhood experiences, positive or negative, I know that it says adverse childhood experiences here, but positive or negative, and your resiliency factors, how have they formed your expectations about yourself and others? So just take a couple of moments. I know that this request is a little like opening up a can of worms because I have been down this rabbit hole several times, but I think it is a good practice for us to think about frequently. And I appreciate your courage in exploring this, this reflection space with me today. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, and I will allow for our friend Kishen to give us some historical context for Native American experiences in education.
Thank you. So hello again. So in the state of California, there's currently over 321,000 Indigenous peoples that live in the state. And there's 109 federally recognized tribes, over 108 different indigenous languages, California indigenous languages. So the state of California is very diverse, and depending on the region where you're working, there will be different, as you've seen with the check-in, different homelands, spaces where indigenous peoples have been since the beginning of time. It's important to understand that in oral tradition, in our oral histories, that we have been in these spaces. We came into creation in these spaces. We do not agree or concur with any concepts of migration from the Bering Straits or any of that sort of theories or philosophies. Rather, our belief is that we came into creation in the spaces where we currently reside. And so for thousands of years, we have had our ceremonies, we've had our worldview, our epistemology, which has guided us in the way that we live. But for scientific evidence, I know a lot of people, want to hear of the scientific piece. One of the centers of the world, Takamildan for Hupa people, has been carbon dated that indigenous peoples have been there for over 12,000 years. Other spaces along the coast, 7 to 12,000 years. So we're looking at over 12,000 years and beyond that indigenous peoples have resided in these spaces, and having this relationship with the natural environment, relationship with other humans, relationship with the spiritual realm. During these periods of time, indigenous peoples had ways of coping, of remaining healthy, protocols in handling things like death, for example, handling disagreements, that these were all part of the lifestyle of indigenous peoples that were here before the time of contact. In Northern California, we didn't have contact with non-indigenous peoples until much later than the rest of the country. And actually, the real periods of contact began during the gold rush in 1850. And this was also a period of time where there was attempted extermination of indigenous peoples as well. And so looking at in 1852, Governor Peter Burnett, he stated in his annual message that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. And so this message not only encouraged military, but also encouraged local settlers to plan their attacks on indigenous Californians. So likewise, California residents alone raised in over $400,000 in bonds to pay for militia expeditions that commonly occurred during ceremony when groups were gathered together. And despite treaties that guaranteed Indian safety and protection, the state of California paid $1 million for Indian scalps, indigenous scalps that were referred to as redskins. So there was a bounty for indigenous people. And this all undoubtedly influences some of the social indicators of what we have today, and we'll continue to talk about that later. Another important piece is to understand that after this period of genocide, and where there were mass genocides that occurred all throughout the state of California, that then indigenous peoples were relocated, stripped away from their homelands, marched. Sometimes we hear about Trail of Tears, but a lot of people are unaware there were many trails of tears where people were marched to reservations. And on these reservations, many were enclosed in barbed wire fences. In some cases, the indigenous peoples were forced to eat out of troughs. They weren't allowed to bear any arms, which means they couldn't hunt, gather, or have any self-sustainability. Then after this period of time began the boarding school era. And that's when children were kidnapped and taken away from their homes and put into boarding schools. And in these boarding schools, and I think this is so key, especially for educators, is for other people throughout the world, education was something for the elite, for those that could afford this prominent education. For Indigenous peoples, it was a tool of assimilation, to kill the Indian, to save the man, to shed everything that made this person Indigenous, their identity, their names, cutting their hair, stripping them of their regalia, stripping them of any relationships or friendships, but most devastating, stripping them away from their homelands and their families, because their families were considered detrimental to the civilization process. In the meantime, we also had periods of slavery happening among Indigenous peoples. Young children who were being kidnapped and sold as slaves, and sometimes as wives to farmers and other settlers. So the history here in this area has been quite devastating, but it's important to talk about and to understand, because research shows that there's a direct lineage between these historical events and between the impacts on our community members of today. And one of those impacts is called intergenerational transmission of adversity, which from these events, when you look at people that have a way of handling death, a process, that have a way, if someone were to die, that a family would adopt them and take them in, a settling up process, all of these different belief systems to be able to cope and to be healthy, and ceremony and song, all of these protective factors. But what happens when the entire village is or almost the entire village is decimated? And so you have a lot of unresolved grief that transfers through generations.
So just adding on to that, to the ongoing experiences in education piece, I'll do my best to talk to you a little bit about my experience as an educator in a predominantly Native American population. Is that it seems as though, a lot of the assimilation practices have continued, right? The public school system seems to be very heavy in content that continues the erasure of Native American children. I think that the students, I remember opening up, we got a new curriculum adoption recently, and I think in the 5th grade, it did have, like, the Yurok tribe was featured in it, and the kids were just so happy to see something that was similar to who they are. However, a lot of times when those are included, it's through like a historical context, right? So it's usually kind of about talking about primitive peoples. And there's not really an acknowledgement for the practices that have continued. In my generation, so all of us are very connected as presenters culturally, and that we have had family, all of our family members have done a lot of amazing work in the revitalization of the cultures and for the Yurok, Karuk, and Hupa people. And our generation, probably, I was very, very young when the first ceremonies kind of came back into practice. And Kishan has done a lot of work recently in revitalizing a ceremony that has been dormant for over 100 years. So there has been a cultural revitalization effort, and this generation of children, like my children, have been born into a societal norm, a cultural societal norm for them that I didn't have access to, right? And where they can grow up being involved in ceremony from a very young age and having that ability to connect spiritually. And not all students have that exposure. So it's really important that as we, as educators, and we are learning about the cultures of Native people, that it's important that we don't consolidate them all into the same culture, as Kishan was talking about. All of the tribes are very, very unique and distinct. I like to kind of say that, like, I am Native American, but I am not knowledgeable of all Native Americans, and I don't represent all of Native Americans. You know, I am Yurok and I'm Karuk, and those are the practices in which I've been raised. And some of our children who are Yurok and Karuk and Hupa may not have had the access to having cultural knowledge. So it's important that when you explore the unique cultural knowledge of your student population, that you're very mindful that not all students have that information. There's a spectrum of knowledge. But going to the public school system and that kind of continued what feels like cultural erasure, it is important to have representation in your classroom. And but there is also very specific information that is not intended to be a part of your classroom. And I would say that that's more on like a ceremonial side, on a cultural, help me out, Kishan, because I know that you're really good at supporting this idea too, that some practices are left for the cultural bearers.
Yeah, I think it's a real important message, and I think oftentimes as teachers, there's so much to do, and teachers have such large jobs, is that sometimes the thought is that there's an expectation to actually teach culture in the classroom, and that's not what this is about. That it's not expected that teachers teach culture or teach about ceremonies or teach these specific things within the classroom. And in some ways that would actually be something that would be culturally inappropriate. But what we are recommending is that teachers are aware that there's an educational system, a protocol, child rearing process that happens within the community, awareness and support, and also school home connections. Sometimes there are people within the community that can come in and share different topics within the classroom. But by creating a space for our children and for their worldview and their perspective, then they can create a place for us. And what I always say is that you know, we forget 70% of what we learn within the first hour, and what we do remember. So after this workshop is over, what we will remember is what personally resonated with us, how we made and struck up a personal connection. And it's the same with our children. And so if they're coming to the school system and they're not making these personal connections, they're less likely to remember the content. So it's an investment for us, ensuring that our children are making this connection and they're remembering the content, and we become personally enriched in the process.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that rescue, Kishan. I wanted to talk about a little bit more. We're hoping to that you recognize that through this historical context and through a continued lack of nurturing for Native American or Indigenous students in your classroom, for this period of time, that it's really, really important that we as adults become as social emotionally literate as possible, like with understanding our own triggers and being able to recognize trauma and triggers in your student populations. And so that kind of takes us to the next slide. So I know many of you are familiar with ACEs. It's becoming a lot more mainstream discussions with working with students, especially students of ethnic backgrounds. So how has the treatment of Native people in our country through the educational lens alone directly impacted our communities? Well, let's look at what we know about adverse childhood experiences and the biological effects of trauma. I added a few more, points in there. This image is owned by a particular group, but I wanted to go ahead and add that feeling of having a marginalized identity and cultural erasure as being something that I would think continues to contribute to an ACEs score. One thing that I thought was really obvious in my community is that there's loss of parents. It's not uncommon for my students to have a deceased parent, sometimes even two deceased parents. And when we have members of our community pass away, the entire community mourns. right? And so the entire community comes together in support of this family who has lost a loved one. Food scarcity is an issue, as well as lack of access to basic needs. In some of our communities, it's so rural and remote that running water and electricity are not part of their home. And then also deeper underneath those roots, those adverse community environments, I added historical trauma and genocide, as Keishan had articulated earlier, as well as that multi-generational trauma. There are, if you're interested, I know that Keishan brought it up earlier too, about like the science, we are at a time right now where we can connect how we've been feeling all along to studies, right? Studies deeply rooted in medical science. And if you are interested in science-based evidence, please consider reading Nadine Burke-Harris's The Deepest Well. This describes the biological consequences of trauma, and her work is echoed in Native scholarly circles as well. Keishan has connected me to a recent experience that I noticed some of you also are in her Chem-Tem class, and learning from the work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird, where there's a lot of scientific evidence being brought together in research to demonstrate that Native American lifestyles, Native American traditions are healing to our on a chromosomal level, and as well as I think that he was talking about in our brain and how the neuroplasticity can heal through those practices that we've been doing all along. I just kind of want to make sure that I put all of my notes. We can add some more resources from Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who has profoundly articulated this kind of interconnectedness of responding to the biological impacts of trauma through cultural practices, and this idea of neuro-decolonization. We know, as Native people, that, reconnecting with our culture feels right, it feels good, and our hearts are becoming more full, and our languages are returning. I see spirituality more visible in our young people, and this work that's being done is really providing that, I guess, the evidence that the colonial mind, right, the medical mind needs to see in order to believe us. And Keishan and I and Lynn were talking yesterday about it's fascinating. I have a colonial mind myself, and I am fascinated by science, but it does kind of sadden me that we have to have a study to prove that this is what we need. This is what we need to heal. So thank you. You can go to the next slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I do also want to make a huge point that a lot of the systems in our educational practices focus on punitive or disciplinary action. And I think that we see this a lot now, kind of more mainstream with regard to Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know how many images and videos of police brutality that I've kind of looked at where I see, maybe I see a person who's backing up, maybe I see a person who's running away, but because I have this trauma-informed lens, I see people who are afraid. I see people who maybe don't have control of their behaviors, right? It's not a choice behavior. This is a default behavior because of the amount of trauma that these people have endured. And our students have that trauma memory, as well as experiencing, continued trauma in their own lives. And that when we see some of these behaviors in your classroom, please, please, please take a moment to reflect. How might administrators and teachers respond to students that are displaying these behaviors? Is the adult action one to support and ask, what has happened? Are you okay? Is there an effort to co-regulate, or is there a default to a punitive action? Can there be benefits and beneficial outcomes to reacting to children with trauma with layers of progressive discipline, or is that not going to make any difference in these responses? Again, when you are in a state of fear and your limbic system is taking over, behavior really isn't a choice anymore. It is a default reaction for survival. So consider what there may be to lose in replacing traditional disciplinary models to models deeply rooted in social emotional literacy and targeted behavior supports. I believe I have as an educator and creating learning environments for several years, that the key to achievement is building safe learning environments and relationships with students. Students need to feel safe so that they can let that limbic guard down, so that they can let somebody in, and that they are motivated and can, like, physically can be in a place to learn. Kishan, do you want to add anything to this part of it? I know that you are doing a lot of work about this particular subject right now.
Yes, and actually goes into the next slide, which I think is my slide as well, so we can move in that direction. And this is what I was mentioning before when we talk about intergenerational transmission of adversity. And what this is that it's intergenerational transmission of toxic stress, and it occurs when adverse experiences alter parent biology or behavior in ways that affect the development and health of their children. And so parenting behaviors, positive experiences, societal factors, and historical traumas, which we talked about before, also influence how health risks are passed from parent to child. And so when you look at even today, Indigenous peoples have, 500% or 5 times more the rate of alcoholism. 79% of children between the ages of 12 and 21, the cause of death is due to violence. And so we have the highest rates of tuberculosis, the highest rates of diabetes, and these health concerns don't just happen. And more research is showing how they have a direct correlation with this, not only trauma that's happening, the ACE or ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, but also in looking at this intergenerational transmission of adversity. And so when we look at this, though, the positive end of it is that our chromosomes are protected by what's called telomeres. And so these telomeres, when they're elongated, they're what protect our chromosomes from, being worn down and end up, a person ends up getting sick, for example. And so what increases the length of these telomeres in order to protect a person's health, in order to ensure that this toxic stress is not, breaking down the child's well-being, is these protective factors. And so when I did this study was actually asking Hupa Yurok Karuk people, what are the 5 most important things that you feel should be taught to your children, that are the most valuable to make sure that we're teaching? And so the things that they came out are listed here on this chart. And there's so many more things that could be listed as well. But the 3 primary components were cultural skills, values, and relationships. And looking at the relationships portion is relationships with the human realm, the natural realm, and the spiritual realm. And talking about relationships with the human realm also includes relationship with self, part of self-care. And I think this is a piece that we have all actually gotten to strengthen during this time of the pandemic, is many of you have had the opportunity to experience isolation. And isolation is something that is common among Indigenous peoples, and preparing for ceremony, in preparing for prayer, we often will go into isolation. And it's about first looking within, looking inside yourself. In order to be true to others, you have to look within. My mom also says a lot that those within come out and are born again, meaning that our ancestors lived within us. And so we take these opportunities to look within ourselves. So then when we come out for ceremony, we're able to come out in a way that's honest and true, our own truth. And that's when we truly become enriched, and we can see the truth and the beauty in others, is when we can see that truth and beauty in ourselves. So that's kind of like a little tip in thinking about how to come out of this pandemic as well. But also in looking at these human relationships is looking at relationships and connection with family. Oftentimes Indigenous peoples have spiritual families, extended families. You may hear Indigenous children saying, oh, he's my cousin or she's my cousin. And there's this connection that everyone is aware of, their villages, their lineages. But sometimes even people that aren't biologically related are still part of a spiritual family. And this is something that parents have identified as being important to teach to their children. Relationships with elders, relationships with the community. These concepts are so important. And I often think of, I had a couple of professors when they learned when I was graduating that I was returning home, that told me that would be professional suicide. And but my goal was different. My goal was for my people, for the community. The reason why I went to school was for my people. It was never to make something for myself as an individual. And so it's a different concept, and it's about this human relationship. Another part of that relationship is this relationship with the natural environment. Um, and as I shared before, in connection to homeland and connection to place, in being of a place, having come into creation from a place, and knowing that from this place that your ancestors, your mothers, danced and prayed and gathered in these very same spaces. And understanding that and having that relationship, gathering, oftentimes when our people gather, when we go out into the mountains, the way that we interact in the mountains, the respect, the reverence, we walk lightly. We always try to leave it nicer than when we arrived there. We only take what we need. Oftentimes we'll work on materials there, but nothing goes to waste. Acknowledging that when a fish, it gives its life, or for us to eat and have nourishment, or if a woodpecker gives its life for our prayer, having respect for that life and the way that we treat it is important, and has been what Native parents have identified as important to teach to our children. Another is spiritual connection and spiritual relationships. When we think of something like here behind me, an Oshweach canoe, Osh, that word means that it has its own life, its own energy or breath that comes through it. And we call ourselves as humans Osh. And we're beings, we breathe in and we take in and out, and Oshweach, it too has its own spiritual life. The same with our regalia, and has its own spiritual life as well. And so our songs, we have a responsibility in caretaking our songs. And these songs have been in our families. Some are new songs that come to you, but others have been in families for, hundreds of years. And so all of these concepts are all part of these spiritual relationships, things that parents identify as important, community members identify as important to teach to our children. The creators, sometimes this gets minimized to one creator and kind of paralleled with other religious beliefs, but in many Indigenous beliefs, there's multiple creators that are a part of our creation stories and our oral history, and having that understanding of that. And then we look into some of the cultural skills, traditional games, regalia making, basket making, fishing, hunting, that these are things that community members identify as being important to teach their children. And two, I would like to draw your attention to is often in the classroom, we know that being a good speaker is important, but oftentimes we kind of miss the piece of being a good listener. And sometimes we have children in the classrooms that are really focusing on listening. Um, and sometimes they're not recognized. And that is a gift. It's a skill to be a good listener, as well as the second one is an observer. Our children in the child rearing process here in the northern parts of California are in a na'as, a baby basket. And in this baby basket, one of the primary things they do is observe. You can carry the basket on your back when you go out to gather acorns or mushrooms or whatever materials you're gathering. You can set the basket against the tree and work, and baby listens and observes through that whole process, observing all of the people, all of the interactions. It's a part of this of child rearing for many Indigenous peoples. And then the next one is values, generosity, sincerity, respect, honor, humility, being humble. I think this is an important one because many Indigenous children do not want to be spotlighted. And sometimes I can think back of when I was in the second grade, they had the spelling test, super speller, and the super speller got to have their name up on the board. I would deliberately miss one every time so my name didn't have to show up there for everybody. I didn't want other people to feel bad because their name wasn't on there too. Humility is something that when we see that in our community members, we often identify them as just beautiful people. That's the goal. Not everyone is humble. Not everyone has all of these relationships, but this is the goal for people. Having patience, compassion, and one that you hear often in the communities here is having a good heart. A person that has a good heart condition, that cares for others, that takes care of others. All of these pieces are all pieces when Indigenous families are talking about what they see as gifted. When they see people in the community and say to themselves, that is how I would want my child to treat people. Or I hope someday that my child has the skills that he has or that she has. And this is what we call giftedness. Giftedness is something that you're striving to be. It's like this bar that we set. Not everyone reaches all of these things. Everyone has something different to contribute to this process. And I want to draw your attention that all the little dots, by the way, are language. That language connects all of these pieces. It's like a basket that you weave, and the language is the root that's connecting it all together. And so in the state of California, when we talk about giftedness, typically what we're looking at is the top 1% of students who test high on the standardized test scores. And that's typically how we base who is gifted. We also, giftedness can be identified by teacher selection as well. And so teachers have selected people, sometimes in the arts, that are gifted and sometimes in other areas. But I wanted to show this to you because it shows that sometimes communities aren't striving to excel on the state standardized tests. Sometimes they're striving for something different. And so when Indigenous peoples are assessed, and when we're looking at the high rates of Indigenous children in California who don't do well on standardized tests, and who don't, graduate from high school, and all of these social indicators and statistics, we also could look at this chart and identify how well these children are doing based off of this chart. And sometimes as teachers, this is what we're not able to see because it's happening within the community, it's happening within ceremonies, it's happening within the homes, and it's happening within other places. And I kind of have a couple thoughts about that. And one is that sometimes we can't see what we don't wipe off our lenses, which is our worldview, our values, beliefs, and experiences, to be able to see. Sometimes we're so conditioned to believe that for a child to live a quote good life, or for a child to be quote happy, or for a child to be quote successful, that it's based off a certain set of standards. And that standard is usually our own, or it's usually the standard of what's given by the state of California. But to understand that children sometimes, what they're bringing into the classroom is all of these gifts and this experience and this worldview and this epistemology that's coming from other places, that when you wipe off those lenses, not only are you able to see the value of the children coming into the classroom, but you yourself are also becoming enriched in that interaction with them. And so ultimately, this is what we're striving to do in education, is to reinstill humanity in the classroom, to value each of our children, to create a space that nurtures their identity. Because once they bring this self-concept into the classroom, and then once they're in school, they start evaluating that self-concept through their self-esteem. And then they move into their social identity. And with their social identity, they're looking at how other people are viewing them. And then they move into the stage of self-efficacy and self-actualization. And that's where they see what their role is within the world. And the educational system can be a part of that, if we somehow can make the education that's happening in the classroom resonate with what children value outside of the classroom. And they can see what their role is within the community, what their role is within the educational system, and what the educational system's role is in a part of that as well.
Thank you. That was so rich. Thank you, Kishan. It does a nice segue into the next topic as well, about intent versus impact, and that having that commitment to learn and reflect. And as she was describing the giftedness idea, you know, I would like for you to reflect about this idea of equity. You know, a lot of us are doing work in equity, and to really try to understand what that means. Or just being really honest with yourself what that means, because we're still really just highlighting, or the expectation for achievement is around a white supremacist curriculum, right? The history of educational system in our community is to promote a specific narrative. And when we talk about equity, we're still talking about making it easier, or maybe making it more supportive, or thinking of ways to continue to promote that same narrative, and to really stretch ourselves into thinking about what does equity really mean. Because I would like to believe that equity means really looking at the rich history, the rich authors, you know, the multicultural resources that we have in this country, and to really kind of change that script. You know, how do we change this narrative to be less focused on maybe getting students to graduate to go to college, and more getting students to be civil servants, or to have civic responsibilities. You know, like I would like for my child to know how to fight, you know, for water rights in our area. I would like for my child to know how to represent her community, to make sure that their life ways are not being challenged, or being threatened by, you know, I guess corporate greed, I guess, is kind of goes along with the water analogy. But I do want to take just a couple of moments to think about a common practice. And I shared this story with Adelaide, and I know that she, it really kind of made sense because it was relational, like as Kishan was saying, that I teach primarily junior high. And when the week of Red Ribbon Week surfaces, you know, the narrative that I feel like I'm expected to teach is, you know, don't do drugs. Drugs are bad. People who do drugs are bad. And that's very, very hard for me to do, because I do know that as a part of survival, and as a part of our community's lack of resources and our traumatic histories, that we have, as Keishan said earlier, I believe that we do have a high rates of drug addiction, people who are really trying to just survive. And if I were to sell this narrative with my students, I would be creating a very hostile learning environment. I would be challenging and forcing them to reflect about their family members that they know and love as being bad people or people who are making bad choices. Instead, I try to take this time to really talk about history, to really talk about genocide. What does that mean? And to go through the timeline of what's available and how we can heal. And then by the last day, right, we are really kind of listing how we have what healthier ways to cope with our stress, with our I don't use, kind of like chronic stress or toxic stress with them, but that's really what they are experiencing. And we make really long lists and kind of make a pact, because I tell them that, in our community, it's so small, they grow up, they go to class at kindergarteners, with a class of kindergartners, they graduate high school with that same class. And that they are going to be, and they literally are cousins and related sometimes, but they are going to be there to support one another in times when, other people might not have access to them. And what are they going to do to support each other in making those choices about being healthy and being safe? Because we also have, sometimes students are engaged, their prefrontal cortexes are not developed, right? And so they're not making logical decisions, and there's a lot of at-risk behavior. So this slide is really just embedded with a lot of resources for you to kind of click and search about other ways to create safe learning environments for your students, really heavily emphasizing growth mindset. I love growth mindset, giving permission to make mistakes, that is how you learn, and that is what we expect. And then also the mindfulness and taking that time to really decompress. I think that we are ready to go into some breakout rooms to kind of reflect on everything that we've really talked about so far. So we have a little bit of a structure that we would like for you to engage with. I've been to several breakout rooms with structure, and it all kind of goes out the window, but this is what we hope to achieve, right? So we really want to give you guys a minute to introduce yourselves, take a couple of minutes to just list, reflect and discuss your most prominent identity markers. And we're going to put a link to that in the chat. There it is, ask and you shall receive. And then maybe a couple of quiet minutes, or you guys just can decide your protocols if you want to engage with the group, to really think about how those identity markers influence or impact how your success or your experiences in the education, and then share out. Does anybody have any questions? All right, and again, if this is not a comfortable enough space for you to be open in dialogue with your breakout room members, then just please be an engaged listener. And hopefully you have an opportunity for last. And I'd like to reintroduce Lynn Risling to share about how arts integration and utilizing culturally responsive art is a pathway to healing and resilience for your students. So without further ado, go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, so because I knew we had limited time, and I had a lot of different thoughts and thinking about this subject, and some experience that I've had working with students and as an artist. I wrote down some of my thoughts, and I thought I would follow that. So forgive me for reading, but also I know that my sound is not always so good, and I think it's on my end, so I apologize for that. And I'm not a tech person. I don't know how to fix it. So eventually maybe I will, but not today. So if you didn't get something or you need something repeated, I can try to do that. And also I can make a copy of what I have written and have it available as part of the email you'll get later on from Adelaide. And so hopefully. Anyway, just bear with me. So I was looking at the question and some of our planning notes, and one of the questions about what I was going to present is, what is the role of arts, education in helping to make school a safe, healing place for students? So I wanted to start by saying I believe that art is healing, which I know that I'm sure that a lot of you feel the same way. Like other forms of art, such as writing, poetry, music, visual and hands-on art can bring joy and other emotions, not always joyful, but often healing to the heart and the spirit. Seeing at art and looking at it, but even more so by being involved in the process, can bring this healing to us. And of course, we all know that there are many, many forms of art that include traditional indigenous art to contemporary art forms, Native people. I see art as a continuum that began with my ancestors and continues today through many forms of art, from making, canoe building, regalia making, carving, which are still happening and continue today. And also through expressions of more contemporary, using contemporary mediums such as painting, like I do. So several years ago, I received a grant from through the Humboldt Area Foundation, which is in our part of the state in Arcata, and to work with a few Native youth through what we call the Teen Advisory Group through United Indian Health at Potawatomi Health Clinic in Arcata. And it was a summer project, and I worked with just a handful of mostly middle-aged students. And so we created a mural panel whose focus was on culture and healing. That was basically the theme. So I designed a piece of artwork and I drew it out on the canvas, and then the students helped. And that's another, we're gonna move forward to see another screen. I think it might be a few forward. So it's not in order we have, but I wanted to skip forward a little bit to get to that image. So if you go probably 3 or 4 in. Keep going. I think it's the next one. Nope, we missed one.
Did I skip it, Lynn? Is it back this way?
Somewhere it's back there. It's back. You have to go backwards.
Back. Okay, I can go backwards.
Back. More.
Another one?
I don't know. I'm not seeing it. I see things open the screen, so somehow I'm not seeing. It's the Teen Advisory one. It should say the title.
Do you know where that one is, Maggie?
For some reason, I can't. I'm not getting.
It's slide 16. It has the big spiral with, well, I guess they all have spirals. I'm sorry. But yeah, there we go.
Right here, yeah. There we go. So sorry, I should have tried to work more closely on this with Maggie. I didn't even think about that. So
No
anyway, here's the students working on the piece. And so this was an opportunity to not only work with teaching some painting skills, of course, but a teaching moment to talk about culture, to talk about the environment and land that our ancestors lived in, that we still are connected to today, and talking about things that are important in our environment as Native people, not just our ancestors, but to many of us today, and talking a little bit about ceremony and what those what's the purpose of those ceremonies, and what are some of the other things in our culture that are still important to us today, including some of our traditional medicines and things like that. So it was really fun working with them, and I think the students really resonated with the painting, and now painting hangs in the lobby of our health clinic in Arcata, which is a large lobby that's all redwood. So it's a 6 foot by 6 foot piece. So anyone walking into the clinic will see that piece. Okay. So after that summer, I received another grant to work in a program called the American Indian Academy at the time, which was part of McKinleyville High School. And I was able to work with students for a whole year project, a whole academic year. And I got to choose the theme that I would be we were working with the students. So I chose salmon because of the importance of salmon to our communities, not only traditionally, but to our people today, to many of our people. And so if you want to move forward, no, actually you're going to move backwards to, I think it could be the one right before this one. So it might be number 15. Yes. So in this project, we created altogether 4 panels, 2 per semester. And it was a very holistic learning experience because it wasn't just about art and the final images. There was so many teaching opportunities and learning opportunities for me as a teacher, as well as the students. And so we started with looking at traditional stories about, so there was some research involved with that and reading about, that kind of thing. This particular panel represented a traditional Karuk story about how Coyote brought salmon back to, or into the human beings world that was hidden by these 2 elderly women that lived somewhere a ways away from a lot of the people, and they hid them underneath their house. And so Coyote had heard about it, and so he was able to figure out a way to trick those 2 women and release the salmon by loosening up boards from the house, letting the flow of the salmon out. So in doing this piece and all these 4 pieces, I started with just basic art. It didn't start out working even on these panels. I taught basic drawing skills, the color wheel, basic designs, many different things. In the meantime, I had them, they each had a sketchbook. And so when they came into the classroom every morning, they worked for, I don't know, 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the most, because it was a 2-hour period for that. They did a sketchbook, and I had all kinds of art books and books about Native art, basically. It was mostly what it was. And they could look through any of those books. They could draw anything they want. They could even write in it if they want. And it was just for their own use. And so it was a good warming up exercise that didn't create any pressure, and it kind of got people in the mode in the mood to think about art and about Indian art. So that's kind of how it started out. And at some point we started, I had them start looking at pictures of salmon, and the thing about doing a big piece like that, you have, how many students in a class, at least 20 were in there. They couldn't all work on it at once. So I had them painting salmon after salmon after salmon at their desk. So they got better and better at it. And then eventually for this particular piece, we cut out all the salmon and glued it onto the piece. So these are all their salmon that they had painted. So that was exciting. And then we also talked about language and what words in our languages for the word salmon in our languages. And so we try to include that on the outside of this house looking in, so that this represented our circular doors looking out of a house into the outside world. So images I don't have with me, but just to go on, another panel we did was representing traditional salmon fishing methods that our ancestors used, and even methods that we use today, such as the dip net fishing and now also the gill net fishing. And in the center of that painting, there was he represented a ceremony we call the first salmon ceremony. That was for when we bring back the salmon each year, the spring salmon, and the whole, we talked about that in the whole ceremony, that, that whole piece or that ritual. And then the third piece was the life cycle of the salmon. So, we brought some science into the project and looked at, what is the salmon cycle? How long are they out in the ocean? Where do they go to lay their eggs? And what is that all about? And so we talked about it and learned about it, and then did this piece that represented that. And that piece was designed by this one particular student when we talked about it. Well, what should that look like, and wanting to show the mouth of the salmon, not the mouth of the Klamath River, because that's where the fish come in, when they first start their journey back home. And the last piece was about what's going on today with our salmon and our waters, and what's happening in the Klamath Basin with all these dams, and how is that affecting the waters and the health of the waters and the health of our salmon. And we had experienced a few years before that a large fish kill because of the algae and the warmth of the water and the fish dams. And then the discussion that was going on with the farmers up in Oregon, and the potato farmers, and their use of the water, and the fishermen, the commercial fishermen, and all these different things. So there were discussions going on, or hearings going on in our area between the tribal people, the commercial fishermen, these other people, all the people that have the stake in this, as well as this corporations that had these that owned the dams, and they were coming up for permission to continue, having these dams. As far as I can't remember all the names of these different regulatory commission or whatever it is. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all that detail, but another part of the whole project was having students talk about this and sharing this with other people. So we took a small group to Sacramento for the education, the California Indian Education Conference, and they presented about the work that they were doing with these murals. And that was really exciting and very empowering for them. And we also brought these panels to Hoopa during their fish fair, which was great to be able to share that and see what other people are doing in the community about talking about salmon. So there were a lot of issues, and a lot of things we talked about, and it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot. Okay, so the next one after that has to do with, let's see, I think it was the first slide, which goes back probably 14 maybe, slide, yeah, that one. Oh, sorry, the one after that, 14, yeah. So the year following that, I was able to receive another grant, very fortunate in that, and to be able to continue working with Native students at McKinley High. So we created these hanging panels. There were also 4 of them. And we did some other art projects before we started painting them, also to have practice just with other art activities. We looked at, I started exposing the students to a lot of other Indian art that's been going on across the nation, traditional art, and also even in South America and Mexico. I had 2 students that were from those areas, and I wanted them to be able to learn about their own or share about their own cultures and their own art from their either from their ancestors or from what people are doing even today. So that was pretty exciting. So people had to do some type of a presentation about their own culture and art. They could either do a PowerPoint, they could write something, or they could do it through an art project. So that was pretty exciting. And that was one thing that I thought is really important, is to be able to give students choices so they don't always have to, you know, this is what we're going to do, a cookie cutter art project that everybody has to follow. You know, you have to choose this theme and you have to do these. I mean, you can have it even a common thing, but how you go about it, you know, what kind of art form, if you give them choices, especially if they've had some experience after a while, you know, maybe the students had a final project that they had to do. They could choose just about anything that was related to their culture and art. But in between, we did these panels, and the first one had to do with a traditional story about, we talked about who are the people that lived here on these, where we have this school, you know, that's the Wiyot people, and who are those people, and where are they located, what is the territory, what is the relationship with other tribes in the area. So we had a piece that showed a traditional story of how the Humboldt Bay was created. And so with a little, I think that was the one that had a map in the middle. And then we talked about our traditions and culture and our natural world that we are part of. And so that panel reflected that. And we had students working at their desks, creating these little cultural images and animals and baskets and drum and all kinds of things, house and salmon. And then we also attach those to the piece like we did with the other one. This piece here has to do with our history that Maggie and Kishan talked about, you know, what happened to our people, you know, and the devastation with the gold mining, and then later on with the boarding schools that were children were taken away, and then the forest industry that devastated many of our forests and also contributed to much of damage to our natural streams and the rivers, and with pollution, and affected the beds where our salmon spawn and things like that. And yet our people were, because they didn't have the livelihood that they had, a way of providing for their people, a lot of our families joined that industry just to make a living, you know. And so that's just the reality, you know, that we had to deal with. So this was about, you know, surviving history. And I asked them, well, how did we do that? How did our ancestors do that? And what are the things we still have today? And those were the spirituality, the adaptability, and resilience. That's the words that we came up with. Okay, so, and then the fourth panel was about what are we doing today? How are we practicing our cultures, you know, and or at least some of our people, you know. And so they attached to that in another class at McKinleyville High, part of that academy was one of our local elders now. She taught regalia making, jewelry, you know, using our natural products, our natural resources to create necklaces and all kinds of art, more hand art, more traditional art. And so I was often in the class helping with that. So I took pictures of some of those students. I took some pictures I had from my own collection of people that are involved in culture today. And we put some of those on that last piece to talk about, you know, what are we involved in today? How is our culture still living and part of our lives? So that was that one. And then, so the last one you go, let's see which way I want to go. It's the one with, I think that's the Zane, the first one, 13. So this piece I did, I was invited by a student, not a student, a teacher. I think it was part of her teaching, her credential. She was earning a credential, and she ran the Native American Club at Zane Middle School in Eureka. And so she invited me to come and do an art project with this small group of students. And there's probably, I don't know, maybe 6 altogether. It's nice to have a smaller group to work with. But again, we talked about, who are the people here? Where does this, this land that, you're walking on right now? Who are the indigenous people here, which also the Wiyot people? So we did a map, again, of the local tribes and, what was important to these people, some of the things that were important in their culture and things that are still important to us today. So we came up with these images, and I brought in images for them to look at. And so, of course, I helped draw out those images, and then they painted those. And then we talked about, what are some of the things that are important to us today, like respect for the earth and education and thinking about our future. We talked, it was a really good experience working with them, and they all seemed to really enjoy it. And now this piece hangs in one of their main offices behind the desk, like the secretary's desk on the wall behind them. So a lot of people can see it. Those other large pieces I did with the salmon, those are also, I forgot to mention, at Potawat Health Village in the lobby when you go in. So a lot of people have seen those pieces. So pretty exciting. We had a reception opening for those pieces invited all the students and their families to come. So that was pretty exciting. I know I covered a lot of things. I think, and I have a lot of resources. I was going to put together a list, I started to, of resources that for teachers to look at that you can share with students, or just to get some of your own ideas, or to become more informed or familiar with Native artists, Native art throughout the country. I just want to throw out a couple. The Smithsonian, the National Museum, an Indian website. You can find civic tribes. It's broken down to all kinds of different areas, and have all these education programs too. But that's a really exciting site. There's, as far as magazines, there's Native News from California, which is so excellent, and what people are doing today. There's the National Museum of the American Indian puts out a magazine specifically on Indian art mainly, but about that museum. It's fantastic. And there's a magazine I just subscribed recently that is, I don't have it offhand. I thought I had it, but it's also on Native contemporary art, especially seeing what people are doing today, up and coming artists, and it's really fantastic to see the work. There's also the Gudani Gallery at Humboldt State University that have had some wonderful exhibits. The Maidu Museum in Roseville, California, the Autry Museum in Southern California have done, they did a really good exhibition of Native California and the natural world environment a few years back. There's a lot of resources out there, so much, that you can expose yourself and your students to. The Crocker Museum in Sacramento had this fantastic exhibition a couple of years ago, and it's going to be a traveling exhibition, so we'll go down to the Autry and to some other places. It's called When I Remember, I See Red, American Art and Activism in California. There's a wonderful catalog that went with it that has pictures of pretty much all the images and a lot of information about individual artists and kind of the history of California Indian art, more of the contemporary, starting mainly in the 50s. But it's pretty exciting. I was very fortunate, and my husband Julian Lang be part of that. Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there. I'm happy to share with people.
Thank you, Lynn, for describing all of your art. I do encourage you to look into some of the resources. They are a great way to explore curiosity with your students, right? You know, as teachers, you do not need to be the expert in the room. You can just be a facilitator and provide access to resources that they might not know exist, and to explore learning alongside your students, teaching your students the joy of learning and engaging and exploring something new together. I do want to go fast forward really quick through the last couple of slides. I know that we are over time, but I think that we can do a 5-minute
I forgot about those, yeah.
Lynn has made some amazing children's
Yeah, I forgot about this one.
And these are accessible and, you know.
Yeah, I forgot. I was gonna mention it.
Did you want to cover it, or did you want me to just go through it really quickly?
Yeah, I'll just say that real quick. These were published by Heyday Books, which also publishes the Native News from California magazine, but a few years ago, and they do represent not all of Native California, but the wide range from Middle and Southern California. So you'll see in those books that the border designs, for example, represent different tribes from throughout California, and also their environments are reflected in, you know, some of the images of the different areas of California, their plant life and animals. And so there's a lot there. And even though you'd think of these, it's because they're board books, they're for just little children, but there's so many other learning opportunities for not just little children, different ages, and even adults. And I've gotten really wonderful feedback from parents who have told me over and over again, this is my little so-and-so's favorite book. And we read it over and over and over, look at all the pictures. So that's been one wonderful feedback, and I'm that it can be used and also used for Indian language, like the cards here don't have any ABC or 1, 2, 3. It's just has the images. Then on the back you can write the words or however you want to do it using your own language. That was the idea behind that.
Nice. So planting seeds for resilience is to connect our young people with early literacy opportunities. And just to segue into the next slide, which is a perfect example of a local Native student, Tessa On, who happens to be Kishan's son, has launched his own children's book series called Northern Howl book series, and these are also accessible. So really we are recognizing that there is a little bit of a gap in a younger literacy opportunities for our local natives, but there is quickly being filled. And so this could also be an opportunity for you to engage in some storytelling, having your students tell stories of their own, and possibly adding art and publishing them even in your own schools, right? And circulating them with your own families. The next slide I will let Kishan talk about. This is her project, Chemtem. Kishan, are you still there?
Yes, so the Chemtem, A Journey Toward Healing, is a really good tool. It was actually written for California Indigenous youth, but it also is a great resource for professionals who work with Indigenous children, families, and communities. And this book includes 27 contributors throughout the state of California. Associated with it is the website, so you can go to chemtemindigenousknowledge.com, and it has a lot of different resources. Some of the projects that are connected to this is a K-12 Next Steps for Educators course, scholarship, ACEs Aware supplemental training for professionals, and this video project that was done by 3 youth at Humboldt State University. I call them youth, but they're college students. And so this video is hot off the press. It's something that was made for specifically educators, but also other professionals. And so it's one that you can view, share with other educators. It's for public use. Thank you.
Yes, and just so that you know, when you get these slides yourself, the actual book cover here is a link to that ChemTem website. So whenever I make Google slide presentations, just know to click everything because it's probably a link. And the next slide just gives some additional educator resources that are from local artists or local authors. The Klamath Trinity Joint Unified School District Indian Education Department has a curriculum catalog that is linked here. Shauna Oteka Makovi has a book of poetry called The Smokehouse Boys, and Chegg Lowry has published 2 books that are really amazing just in the last year or so that you need to check out. And I'm pretty sure Smokehouse Boys I know is available on Amazon, and I think that you might need to contact the Blue Lake Rancheria to get copies of Soldiers Unknown and My Sisters.
And just to add, Soldiers Unknown is a graphic novel, which is really popular with middle school age children.
Yes, thank you for adding that. We just want to close out. There are some slides in the slide deck, as you will see, that include our bios and just some additional resources, but we would like to close out with a Padlet if you want to reflect on something that you are taking away from this session. You don't have to do it right now. You can really take some time to reflect. It's an asynchronous opportunity, but you can grab the Padlet from using the QR code. If you're not familiar with QR codes, if you do have a smartphone, you can put it into a camera, and like you're going to take a picture, and you just kind of hover your camera over the top of that QR code, and then a little menu will pop up at the top that takes you directly to this link on the internet. If you don't mind just clicking it real quick, Adelaide, so they know what it looks like when they get there. I think that we can, or it would just be the final reflection on Padlet. You just go ahead and click that. It should bring you, there you go. So this is what it would take you to. So if you wanted to just go to that little circular pink plus button at the bottom, you can add your final thoughts, something that you're taking away from today. And the best way for me to continue to grow and learn is from getting feedback from others. And I would love to hear what you guys have to share. And as you explore that, I just wanted to say my final thank yous for joining us today. Waklau, Yutwa, Set Diet for joining us. And if there's Kishan and Lynn, if you would like to say your final thank yous.
Waklau, thank you.
Yutwa Koda.
Thank you, Adelaide, for this opportunity to hang out with your folks. It's been a great night, and I hope to see them soon again in another webinar or event.
Oh, me too, Maggie. Thank you so much for everything you brought to the group today. I'm so grateful to everyone for being here. I just want to say again, please expect in your inboxes soon a really hearty email full of links and resources coming out of this event. So we'll get that to you soon. Thank you all so much.